A full plane, a delayed flight, and a pilot with a dangerous sense of authority. When Captain Richard Morrison singles out a black woman, demanding she give up her first-class seat for another passenger, he thinks he's just laying down the law. He scoffs at her quiet defiance, her calm refusal. But when he threatens to have her removed, she looks him dead in the eye and utters 7 words that will end his career. Then you'll never fly again. This isn't just a story about an argument on a plane. This is the story of how one man's prejudice collided with a powerful secret, and how karma delivered its verdict at 30,000 feet. The air in Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 3 was a familiar symphony of chaos. The rhythmic roll of suitcase wheels on linoleum, the distant, garbled announcements of final boarding calls, the low hum of 1,000 conversations blending into an anonymous white noise. For Dr. Isabella Hayes, it was a sound she had grown accustomed to, a necessary evil in a life that often required her to be in 3 different time zones in a single week. Today, however, was different. There were no board meetings, no keynote speeches, no high-stakes negotiations waiting for her. Today she was just Isabella, a daughter going to visit her ailing mother in Des Moines, Iowa. She had deliberately booked a seat on the smaller regional jet Pinnacle Air Flight 417, hoping for a sliver of anonymity. She wore simple, comfortable grey slacks, a cashmere sweater, and sensible flats. Her usually immaculate hair was pulled back in a simple, elegant bun, and behind her, non-prescription glasses, her sharp, intelligent eyes scanned the terminal, not with the predatory focus of a C-suite executive, but with the weary patience of any other traveler. She carried no bulky briefcase, only a well-worn leather tote bag that contained a book on astrophysics, her tablet, and a half-finished knitting project, a scarf for her mother, Martha. The mundanity of it all felt like a costume, a welcome disguise from the weight of her real life. Dr. Isabella Hayes wasn't just a frequent flyer. She was a ghost in the machine of the very industry she was currently patronizing. Boarding began with the usual tiered procession. Isabella, holding a ticket for seat 1A, was in the first group. It was a bulkhead seat offering precious legroom on the notoriously cramped CRJ 700 aircraft. She had chosen it specifically, hoping the extra space would allow her to work on her laptop without her elbows ending up in her neighbor's lap. She settled into her seat, the worn leather cool against her skin. She smiled politely at the flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah, with kind eyes and a name tag that looked slightly askew. Sarah returned the smile, a genuine warmth that seemed to defy the stressful environment. "Welcome aboard," Mom Sarah said. "Can I take your coat for you?" "Thank you, but this sweater is fine," Isabella replied, her voice low and melodic. She stowed her tote bag under the seat in front of her, a space designated by airline policy, and pulled out her book. She was just losing herself in a chapter about stellar nucleosynthesis when a shadow fell over her page. She looked up to see a man in his late 40s, dressed in a rumpled business suit that had likely been expensive a decade ago. He had a florid face, thinning blonde hair, and a look of profound entitlement. He clutched a boarding pass for seat 1C, the aisle seat in her row. "Excuse me," he said, his voice a nasal pronouncement. "You're in my seat." Isabella blinked slowly, then offered a small, polite smile. "I don't believe so. I'm in 1A. She gestured to the placard on the wall beside her head. The man whose name she would later learn was Mark Jensen huffed impatiently. No. My company books the bulkhead for me. Always. I'm a Platinum Medallion member." He brandished his boarding pass as if it were a royal decree. "You need to move." The sheer audacity of the demand was momentarily stunning. Sarah, the flight attendant, who had been helping another passenger nearby, immediately stepped in. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" She asked, her voice a model of customer service professionalism. He thrust it at her. "Jensen." "Seat 1C. This woman is in the wrong seat." Sarah glanced at the pass, then at Isabella. "So this passenger is in seat 1A, the window seat. Your assigned seat is 1C on the aisle. They're both bulkhead seats. I don't want the aisle." Jensen snapped his voice, rising. "I want the window. The glare from the galley lights bothers my eyes. She can take the aisle." It was a patently absurd excuse, a thin veil for some other unspoken objection. Isabella felt a familiar, weary tightening in her chest. She had seen this movie before in different theaters with different actors, but always the same plot. She, a black woman, occupying a space that someone like Mark Jensen felt was rightfully his. "So the seats are assigned," Sarah said, her professional calm beginning to fray at the edges. "This passenger has booked 1A. I can't ask her to move." "Why not?" Jensen demanded, his voice now loud enough to draw the attention of other boarding passengers. "It's just a seat. It's an equivalent exchange." "What's the problem?" He didn't look at Sarah when he spoke. His dismissive gaze was fixed squarely on Isabella, as if daring her to object. Isabella held his gaze, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was its own answer. She would not be moved. So Sarah tried again, her voice a little firmer. "If you'd like, I can see if there's another window seat available once everyone has boarded, but I cannot force this passenger from her assigned seat." "This is ridiculous," Jensen fumed. He threw his briefcase into the overhead bin with a loud thud. "I pay thousands of dollars a year to this airline. I expect a certain level of service. I'm not sitting on the aisle." He crossed his arms, standing obstinately in the narrow aisle, creating a logjam of passengers behind him. The tension in the small cabin was escalating. People were grumbling, eager to get to their seats. Sarah's face was flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. Isabella simply turned back to her book, reopening it to the page she'd been reading. It was a deliberate, calculated act of dismissal. She would not participate in his tantrum. Infuriated by her composure, Jensen leaned down, his face uncomfortably close to hers. "Are you deaf? I'm talking to you. Get up and move to the aisle seat." Isabella slowly closed her book, her finger marking her page. She turned her head and looked up at him, her eyes as cold and vast as the deep space she was reading about. "No," she said. The word was not loud, but it carried an undeniable finality. "What did you say to me?" he snarled. "I believe you heard me," Isabella replied evenly. "That's it." Jensen straightened up his face, a mask of indignation. "I'm going to speak to the pilot. We'll see who moves then." He stormed past Sarah towards the front of the aircraft, disappearing into the cockpit. Sarah shot Isabella an apologetic look. "I am so sorry about this, ma'am." "It's not your fault," Isabella said, her voice softening as she addressed the flight attendant. "You handled it perfectly." Sarah gave a weak smile and moved to continue her duties, but the atmosphere on the plane had changed. The unsettling calm had been shattered, and a palpable sense of dread began to creep through the cabin. Other passengers were now whispering, some casting sympathetic glances at Isabella, others glaring at her, as if she were the source of the delay. Isabella ignored them all. She leaned her head back against the seat, closed her eyes, and waited. She knew this was far from over, and she had a sinking feeling that Mr. Jensen was about to find a sympathetic ear in the cockpit. The cockpit door swung open with a decisive click, and Captain Richard Morrison emerged. He was a man who wore his authority, like his uniform, starched, pressed, and with an air of absolute command. He was in his late 50s, with a square jaw, steel grey hair cut in a severe military style, and pale blue eyes that seemed to survey the world from a position of inherent superiority. He had been a pilot for 30 years, first in the Air Force, and then with commercial carriers, and he carried the unshakable belief that his cockpit was his kingdom and the plane his domain. Mark Jensen trailed behind him like a smug vizier, a smirk playing on his lips. He pointed a triumphant finger at Isabella. "That's her captain, in the seat I told you about." Captain Morrison's gaze fell upon Isabella. It was not a glance. It was an assessment, a judgment. He scanned her simple attire, her calm demeanor, and his expression hardened almost imperceptibly. He saw not a distinguished academic or a powerful businesswoman, but simply a black woman occupying a prime piece of real estate on his aircraft. He strode down the aisle, his presence commanding the attention of the entire cabin. Passengers fell silent, their phones lowered. This was no longer a petty squabble. This was an official intervention. "Ma'am," Captain Morrison began, his voice a low baritone that brooked no argument. "I'm Captain Morrison. There seems to be a misunderstanding about the seating." "There is no misunderstanding," Captain Isabella replied, her voice steady. "I am in seat 1A, the seat assigned on my ticket. This gentleman is in 1C. He wishes for me to switch with him. I have declined." Morrison's lips thinned. He clearly wasn't accustomed to passengers, especially women who looked like Isabella, speaking to him with such directness. "Ma'am, Mr. Jensen here is one of our most valued frequent flyers," the captain explained, as if this settled the matter. "He has a specific seating preference for medical reasons." He gestured vaguely toward Jensen. "The galley lights. It's a migraine issue." The lie was so bald-faced, so transparently fabricated on the spot, that Isabella almost laughed. The galley was behind them, and its lights were currently dimmed for takeoff. She could see Sarah, the flight attendant, standing near the galley, her eyes wide with disbelief. Sarah knew it was a lie. The captain knew it was a lie. And they both knew that Isabella knew it was a lie. "With all due respect," Captain Isabella said, keeping her tone respectful but firm, "if the passenger has a documented medical need for a specific seat, it should have been arranged with the airline's disability services desk prior to boarding, not adjudicated here in the aisle." This was the wrong thing to say. It challenged his authority, with logic, with policy. It suggested he was wrong. A flicker of anger flared in Morrison's pale eyes. "I am the captain of this aircraft," he stated, his voice dropping a decibel and gaining a menacing edge. "My authority is final on all matters concerning the safety and operation of this flight, and that includes passenger seating. To avoid further delay, I am instructing you to move to seat 1C. It was no longer a request. It was an order. An unlawful one, but an order nonetheless. The entire cabin was now rapt. This was live theatre, a raw drama of power and prejudice unfolding at gate C12. Isabella took a slow, deliberate breath. She looked past the captain's imposing figure to the faces of the other passengers. She saw a spectrum of reactions, fear, annoyance, a few glimmers of outrage, and a chilling amount of indifference. This was the moment of decision. She could acquiesce, move to the aisle, and endure the humiliation in silence. The flight would take off. The incident would be forgotten by everyone but her. Or she could stand her ground. She thought of her mother, a woman who had faced down far worse indignities in her life with unwavering grace and strength. She thought of the countless times she had been underestimated, overlooked, or outright challenged because of her race and gender. She thought of the responsibility that came with her position, a position none of these people could possibly fathom. And she made her choice. Captain Morrison. She said, her voice, now devoid of any warmth, as precise and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. I will state this one last time. I will not be moving from my assigned seat." A collective gasp went through the nearby rows. Mark Jensen looked positively giddy with anticipation of the coming explosion. The captain's face went rigid, his jaw muscle clenched. "Mum," he said through gritted teeth, "you are now interfering with the duties of a flight crew. That is a federal offense. If you do not comply with my direct order immediately, I will have you deplaned. We will not take off until you are off this aircraft." He thought this was his trump card, the ultimate threat. He expected tears or angry shouting or a sullen, defeated retreat. He did not expect the reaction he received. Isabella looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. A profound and unnerving stillness settled over her. She seemed to draw all the energy and tension in the cabin into herself, holding it for a single, silent beat. Then she spoke. Her voice was not loud. It was barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the tense silence with the devastating force of a sonic boom. "Then you'll never fly again." The 7 words hung in the air, freighted with an impossible weight. For a moment, there was only stunned incomprehension. Captain Morrison stared at her, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. It was so audacious, so utterly unbelievable, that he could only interpret it as the nonsensical threat of a powerless, hysterical woman. A slow, derisive smile spread across his face. "Is that a threat?" He chuckled, a harsh, ugly sound. "It is not a threat," Captain Isabella said, her voice as calm as a frozen lake. "It is a statement of fact. A consequence. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to finish my chapter before takeoff." Or perhaps she added, tilting her head slightly, "before you are removed from this aircraft." The sheer, unadulterated confidence behind her words finally pierced Morrison's armor of arrogance. He was momentarily speechless. He looked at her, this quiet black woman, in a simple sweater, and for the first time, a sliver of doubt, a tiny black seed of fear, planted itself in his gut. Who was she? But his pride, a massive and brittle thing, quickly reasserted itself. He would not be challenged on his own plane. "That's it." He snarled, his face now crimson with rage. "You're off. Sarah, call airport security. Have this passenger removed immediately." Sarah, who had been watching the entire exchange with a horrified expression, flinched. "But, Captain—" Now he roared. Isabella showed no emotion. She didn't protest or argue. As Sarah reluctantly picked up the intercom phone, Isabella calmly began to gather her things. She carefully placed her book into a tote bag, retrieved her knitting, and stood up. She moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace that was more unsettling than any outburst would have been. She looked at Captain Morrison one last time. "You've made a catastrophic error in judgment, Captain," she said softly. Then she turned to the shell-shocked Mark Jensen. "Enjoy the seat," she said, her tone dripping with ice. "I imagine it will be the most expensive one you ever sit in." With that, she walked calmly down the aisle, past the gawking passengers, and stood by the open aircraft door, waiting. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The chain of events she was about to set in motion was already forged, and its first link was being pulled tight. Captain Richard Morrison, puffed up with his victory, watched her go, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just piloted his own career straight into a mountain. Isabella stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool, sterile air, a stark contrast to the heated tension inside the plane. The gate agent, a harried-looking woman named Brenda, avoided her eyes, mumbling something about security being on their way. Isabella simply nodded and walked a few paces away, stopping near a large window that overlooked the tarmac. Below, baggage carts buzzed around the belly of Pinnacle Air Flight 417 like worker bees. She paid them no mind. She didn't feel anger, not yet. Anger was a hot, messy emotion. What she felt was a cold, crystalline resolve. The incident was no longer about a seat. It was about a systemic rot that she, in her unique position, was obligated to address. Captain Morrison wasn't just a rogue employee. He was a symptom of a disease. From her tote bag, she retrieved her personal cell phone. It was a sleek, unassuming device, but it was one of the most powerful tools in the aviation industry. She scrolled through her contacts, bypassing her personal assistant, her chief of staff, and her legal team. She went straight to the top. Her thumb hovered over a name saved simply as Robert Chen. She pressed the call button. It rang twice before it was answered. Isabella, to what do I owe the pleasure I thought you were taking? A few days off, a man's voice, rich with a warm baritone, confidence came through the phone. Hello, Robert. Isabella said, her voice calm and even. I was. But there's been a development. Robert Chen, the chief executive officer of Pinnacle Air's parent company, Global Air Transit Holdings, was sitting in his 50th floor office in Atlanta. He was in the middle of a quarterly review, but the name on his caller ID took precedence over everything. Dr. Isabella Hayes was not just a member of his board of directors. She was the single largest individual shareholder and the chair of the crucial Safety and Standards Committee. She was a legend in the aerospace world, a brilliant engineer who had made a fortune on avionics patents before transitioning into the corporate stratosphere. When Isabella called his personal line, it was never to chat. A development he asked a hint of concern entering his voice. He motioned for his subordinates to leave his office, waving them out with a flick of his wrist. Is everything all right? Is your mother okay? My mother is fine. Thank you for asking. I, however, have just been forcibly deplaned from one of your aircraft. There was a dead silence on the other end of the line. Robert Chen, a man who navigated billion-dollar mergers and international aviation crises without breaking a sweat, was momentarily stunned into speechlessness. You've... What he finally managed, his voice, a choked whisper. Say that again. I was on a Pinnacle Air flight, 417 from O'Hare to Des Moines. In seat 1A, Isabella stated, providing the facts with cold precision. A passenger in 1C demanded my seat. When I refused the pilot, a Captain Richard Morrison intervened. He falsely claimed the other passenger had a medical need and ordered me to move. When I refused to comply with his unlawful order, he had me removed from the flight for interfering with a flight crew. Chen was now standing, pacing his office, the color draining from his face. Isabella. My God. Where are you now? I'm on the jet bridge at gate C12. Airport security is presumably on its way to arrest me, she said, a dry, humorless note in her voice. No, Chen said, his voice now a low growl of controlled fury. No, they are not. Stay right where you are. Do not speak to anyone. I am handling this. Right now. Robert Isabella continued, her tone unwavering. This isn't just about me. The captain's behavior was a disgrace. It was overt, undisguised discrimination. The flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah, was trying to do the right thing, and he humiliated her as well. This man is a liability of catastrophic proportions. He represents a rot in your company's culture that needs to be excised. I understand, Isabella. Completely. Morrison. Richard Morrison. He was scribbling the name down on a legal pad. Consider him gone. Consider his entire career vaporized. What do you need me to do first? Ensure no security personnel lays a hand on me. Second, I want that plane brought back to the gate. I want Captain Morrison relieved of his command publicly. I want every passenger on that flight to see that Pinnacle Air does not, under any circumstances, tolerate this behavior. Third, I still need to get to Des Moines. My mother is expecting me. Done. Chen said without hesitation. "All of it. I'm calling David Sterling at the O'Hare hub right now. He'll be there in 5 minutes. Isabella?" "I am so sorry. This is an unforgivable failure on our part. We'll discuss the broader failures at the next board meeting." "Robert, Isabella said the implication clear. This would not be swept under the rug." "For now, just handle your pilot." "I will," he promised, his voice grim. Isabella ended the call. She leaned against the window, watching the ground crew who were now standing around, looking confused. The baggage loader had stopped. The jet's fuel hose was still attached. Nothing was moving. The flight was clearly not preparing for imminent departure. Inside the aircraft, Captain Morrison was feeling a surge of triumphant satisfaction. He had reasserted his authority. He had put the disruptive passenger in her place and rewarded a loyal customer. He strode back into the cockpit, giving a smug nod to Mark Jensen, who was now comfortably installed in seat 1A. "All right, folks," Morrison's voice came over the PA system, full of false bonhomie. "Apologies for that minor delay. We had a small issue with a passenger that has now been resolved. We should be on our way shortly." His first officer, a younger man named Kenji Tanaka, shot him a worried look. "Are you sure that was the right call, Captain? She just refused to move. The guy in 1C was being a real jerk. She was interfering with the crew. Kenji Morrison snapped, his good mood evaporating. "My order is law on this plane. Don't you forget it. Now let's run the pre-flight check again." They went through the motions, but the call to the tower for pushback clearance wasn't being answered with the usual alacrity. There were delays, holds, requests to stand by. Morrison was growing increasingly irritated. "What the hell is going on with ground control?" he grumbled, keying his mic. "Pinnacle 417, to ground requesting pushback and taxi ready to go." The reply came back cold and official. "Pinnacle 417, stand by. Hold your position at the gate. A company supervisor is en route to your aircraft." Morrison stared at the console. A company supervisor? Why to file a report on the passenger? That was usually done after the flight. A cold knot of unease began to tighten in his stomach. The tiny seed of doubt that Isabella had planted began to sprout. He looked out the cockpit window toward the jet bridge. He could see the woman he'd kicked off standing calmly by the terminal window, her phone to her ear. She didn't look distressed. She didn't look angry. She looked powerful. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. "Then you'll never fly again." The words echoed in his mind, no longer sounding like a hollow threat, but like a prophecy. Who the hell was she? His question was about to be answered in the most brutal and public way imaginable. David Sterling, Pinnacle Air's Chicago Hub Operations Director, moved through the crowded terminal like a shark parting a school of fish. He was a tall, impeccably dressed man in his early 40s, known for his unflappable demeanor in the face of snowstorms, computer failures, and security threats. But the phone call he had just received from Robert Chen had rattled him to his core. The CEO had not been angry. He had been apocalyptic. The instructions were terrifyingly simple. Fix this, or don't bother coming to work tomorrow. He spotted Dr. Hayes immediately standing by the window at gate C12. He had seen her picture in corporate reports, but had never met her in person. He approached her cautiously, his face a mask of profound apology. "Dr. Hayes," he said, his voice hushed. "I'm David Sterling. Mr. Chen sent me. On behalf of every single employee of this airline, I am deeply and unreservedly sorry for what you have just experienced." Isabella turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Sterling, your timing is impeccable." The gate agent was just about to call the police. David winced, as if he'd been physically struck. "That will not be happening, Doctor." I assure you, we are taking immediate action. The aircraft is being held at the gate. Captain Morrison's flight career with Pinnacle Air has just ended. He just doesn't know it yet. Good, Isabella said simply. I have been instructed to escort you back onto the aircraft to your original seat as soon as we have addressed the captain. David continued. A new flight crew is being assembled as we speak. We can have you on your way to Des Moines within the hour. And the other passenger, Isabella asked. Mr. Jensen. Mr. Jensen. David said his voice, laced with contempt, will be given the choice to either deplane voluntarily with a full refund and a travel voucher, or be deplaned involuntarily and banned from this airline for life. His platinum medallion status has already been revoked. Isabella gave a slight, sharp nod. The response was swift and total. It was what she expected. Let's proceed, she said. David spoke quietly into his radio. All teams execute. Gate C-12. Inside the aircraft, the passengers were growing restless. The flight was now delayed by nearly 30 minutes. Captain Morrison was in the cockpit, fuming at the inexplicable hold when the cabin door opened. It wasn't a gate agent. It was David Sterling, flanked by 2 uniformed airport security officers. The officers, however, were not looking at the passengers. They were looking directly at the cockpit. A wave of confusion and alarm swept through the cabin. David Sterling ignored the passengers. He walked directly to the cockpit door and stood there, his face grim. Captain Morrison, he said, his voice loud enough for the entire front of the plane to hear. I am David Sterling, Hub Operations Director. By order of the CEO, Robert Chen, you are hereby relieved of your command, effective immediately. The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the cabin. First Officer Kenji Tanaka's jaw dropped. Morrison unbuckled his harness and stood up, his face a mottled patchwork of red and white. On what grounds? I haven't done anything wrong. I removed a disruptive passenger per FAA regulations. You removed a member of this company's board of directors and our single largest shareholder. Richard David said, his voice cold as ice. The use of his first name was a deliberate stripping of his rank. You did so based on a transparently false pretense to satisfy the prejudiced complaint of another passenger. You have created a multi-million-dollar liability for this company in the last half hour. You are suspended pending an investigation that will result in your termination. Your wings are clipped. Now take your bag and get off this aircraft. The word shareholder and board of directors rippled through the cabin like a shockwave. Passengers looked at each other in stunned disbelief. The woman in the simple grey sweater, a board member, Mark Jensen, sitting in seat 1A, turned a ghastly shade of pale. He suddenly felt like he was sitting on a lit stick of dynamite. He began to shrink into the seat, trying to make himself invisible. Morrison was utterly broken. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a waxy, slack mask of horror. All the arrogance, all the authority evaporated in an instant, replaced by a raw, primal fear. He finally understood. He looked past Sterling through the cabin door and saw Isabella Hayes standing on the jet bridge, watching. Her quiet prophecy. Then you'll never fly again, crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise from on high. Wordlessly he stumbled out of the cockpit, grabbing his flight bag. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. He couldn't. The walk down the aisle was the longest, most humiliating journey of his life. The eyes of every passenger were on him, burning into his back. They were no longer the faces of people under his command. They were the faces of his jury, his judges, witnessing his spectacular self-inflicted execution. As he reached the aircraft door, David Sterling stepped aside. Morrison walked onto the jet bridge, past Isabella. his gaze fixed on the floor. He was a king stripped of his crown, exiled from his own kingdom. Once Morrison was clear, David Stirling stepped back into the cabin. His eyes found Mark Jensen. "Mr. Jensen," he said, his voice carrying through the silent plane. "My name is David Stirling. We have a seat for you on a later flight this evening. We will also provide you with a full refund for this ticket and a $500 travel voucher for your trouble. I would strongly advise you to accept this offer and deplane now." The unspoken alternative hung heavy in the air. Jensen practically scrambled out of the seat. He was sweating profusely, his hands trembling as he fumbled to retrieve his briefcase from the overhead bin. He wouldn't even look in Isabella's direction as he scurried off the plane like a frightened rat. Then David Stirling turned to the remaining passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice regaining a measure of professional calm. "On behalf of Pinnacle Air, I want to offer our most sincere apologies for this unacceptable incident and the resulting delay. A new captain and first officer will be here shortly. We appreciate your patience." He then turned and gestured to the doorway. Dr. Isabella Hayes walked back onto the aircraft. She moved with the same quiet dignity as before, but everything had changed. The way the passengers looked at her was different. It was a mixture of awe, fear, and newfound respect. She walked down the aisle and without a word settled back into seat 1A. She placed her tote bag beneath the seat in front of her, pulled out her book on astrophysics, and opened it. The silence was broken by a tentative voice. An elderly woman in the row behind her leaned forward. "Ma'am," she said softly, "I just want to say thank you." What he did was wrong. A man across the aisle nodded. Damn right it was. "Good for you." A quiet murmur of assent spread through the cabin. Sarah, the flight attendant, approached Isabella, her eyes shining with tears of relief and vindication. "Dr. Hayes," she whispered, I don't know what to say." Isabella looked up from her book and gave Sarah a small, genuine smile. "You have nothing to say, Sarah. You conducted yourself with grace and professionalism under immense pressure. I won't forget that." The karma had been delivered. It was swift, brutal, and public. But for Isabella, the flight was not over, and neither was the fallout. This wasn't just about one pilot. It was about ensuring no one else would ever have to endure what she just had. The real work was just beginning. For Richard Morrison, the days that followed were a descent into a bureaucratic and personal hell. The suspension was immediate and indefinite. He was instructed to surrender his company ID and his airport access badge. The pilots' union, while obligated to represent him, was lukewarm at best. His union representative, a weary veteran named Tom Prentice, laid it out for him in stark terms, in a small, windowless office at the union headquarters. "Rich, I've seen the preliminary report from the company," Tom said, sliding a thin file across the desk. "It's bad. You've got a dozen passenger statements corroborating Dr. Hayes' account. You've got a glowing report about her from the flight attendant, Sarah, which paints you as an aggressor. You have the operations director, David Stirling, as a witness to the aftermath. And worst of all, you have the victim." "She's not a victim. I was maintaining order on my aircraft," Morrison protested, but his voice lacked its old conviction. It was thin and reedy. "She's Dr. Isabella Hayes," Tom said, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his tired eyes. "They call her the ghost of the boardroom, because you never see her coming, but she knows everything. She holds a PhD in aerospace engineering from MIT. She designed the guidance system for the new Boeing 797. Her patents are in every plane we fly, and she owns 8% of Global Air Transit Holdings. You didn't just kick a passenger off a plane, Rich. You kicked the queen off the chessboard. There is no winning this. There is only mitigation. So what happens? Morrison asked, his voice barely a whisper. The company will offer you a deal, Tom explained. Resign immediately, and they'll list your departure as voluntary separation. No fuss, no public firing. You walk away with your pension vested. If you fight it, they will take you to a full FAA conduct hearing. They will bring Dr. Hayes to testify. They will bring every passenger from that flight, if they have to. They will terminate you for cause, and the FAA will likely review and possibly revoke your airline transport pilot license. Your career won't just be over at Pinnacle, it'll be over, period. The words hit Morrison like a physical blow. 30 years of his life, his identity, his entire sense of self-worth was built around being Captain Morrison. Without his wings, who was he? His pride, the very thing that had caused this catastrophe, made one last desperate stand. It was about respect for the uniform, he muttered. She was defiant. She was a black woman who refused to be bullied out of a seat she paid for. Tom counted his patience gone. And you, my friend, picked the wrong one. Take the deal, Rich. It's the only hand you have left to play. Morrison went home in a daze. His wife, Linda, greeted him at the door. She was a woman who had built her life around the prestige of being a captain's wife. The country club membership, the nice house in the suburbs, the overseas vacations, it was all funded by Richard's 6-figure salary and his godlike status at the airport. "You're home early," she said, noticing his ashen face. "Is everything all right?" He couldn't bring himself to tell her. The shame was too great. Engine trouble on the plane. He lied. "They sent us home for the night." The lie festered. For a week he pretended to go to work, leaving the house each morning in his uniform, and sitting in a coffee shop near the airport, watching the planes take off and land. He felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that was no longer his. He drafted his resignation letter, 12 times, the words sticking in his throat. Meanwhile, the financial pressures that had been silently mounting in his life began to close in. The second mortgage he'd taken out to fund a bad investment, the credit card debt from trying to keep up with the other pilots' lifestyles, the bills were piling up. He had been counting on his annual performance bonus to stay afloat. That bonus was now gone. A week after the incident, a certified letter arrived. It was from the airline formally offering him the resignation deal. It gave him 48 hours to respond. That same day, a foreclosure notice was taped to their front door. Linda found it first. "Richard," she screamed, her voice shrill with panic. "What is this? What's happening?" The dam of his lies finally broke. In a torrent of pathetic excuses and self-pity, he told her everything. About the passenger, the confrontation, the suspension, the ultimatum. He tried to paint himself as the victim. A man just trying to do his job, brought down by some politically correct corporate witch hunt. Linda didn't see a victim. She saw a fool. She saw the man who had gambled away their entire life on a moment of stupid racist pride. "You did this?" "For a seat?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and contempt. "You threw away everything because you couldn't stand a black woman sitting in first class. Are you insane?" The argument that followed was brutal. It dredged up years of resentment of his arrogance, of their precarious finances. By the end of it, she was packing a bag. "I can't do this, Richard," she said, her face cold and hard. "I can't be married to a failure, and I certainly can't be married to a man so full of hate that he'd burn his own house down to feel powerful for 5 minutes. She left that night. Richard Morrison was alone in a house he was about to lose, with a career that was already dead. The unraveling was complete. He finally signed the resignation letter. Far away from the wreckage of Morrison's life, Dr. Isabella Hayes was enacting a different kind of change. At the next quarterly board meeting of Global Air Transit Holdings, the incident on Flight 417 was the first item on the agenda. Robert Chen began with a formal public apology to her in front of the entire board. Isabella accepted it with a gracious nod, but her expression was firm. "Thank you, Robert," she said, her voice commanding the attention of the hushed room. "But apologies are insufficient. What happened to me was not an isolated event. It was the product of a corporate culture that has for too long paid lip service to diversity and inclusion without implementing policies with real teeth." She laid out her proposal. It was not a request. It was a directive backed by her shareholder power and moral authority. First, a complete overhaul of Pinnacle Air's customer service and conflict resolution training, with a new mandatory module on implicit bias and de-escalation developed by leading sociologists. Second, the establishment of a new independent civilian complaint review board for the airline, allowing passengers to report employee misconduct to a body outside of the standard customer service channels. Third, a zero-tolerance one-strike policy for any verified incident of discrimination by an employee, from gate agents to pilots. Termination would be immediate, not preceded by a lengthy suspension. And finally, she addressed the positive. The flight attendant on my flight, Sarah Jenkins, acted with exemplary professionalism. She was calm, respectful, and attempted to de-escalate the situation correctly before being overruled by her superior. She is exactly the kind of employee we should be cultivating. She looked directly at Robert Chen. "I want her given a commendation and fast-tracked for a management training program. We need to reward the good as swiftly as we punish the bad." The board voted unanimously to approve all of her proposals. The Hayes mandates, as they came to be known internally, would ripple through the entire company, changing its DNA from the top down. Her work done, Isabella finally took her delayed trip to Des Moines. As she sat by her mother's bedside, knitting the scarf she had started on the plane, her mother Martha squeezed her hand. "I read about what happened," Martha said, her voice frail but proud. "You did good, honey. You stood your ground just like your father taught you." Isabella smiled a genuine, warm smile. "I learned from the best," she said, looking at her mother. The fight had been ugly, but it had been necessary. And as she sat there in the quiet of her mother's room, she finally felt a sense of peace. Months melted into a year. The seasons changed, but the consequences of that day on Pinnacle Air Flight 417 continued to reverberate for everyone involved. For Richard Morrison, the fall was as total as it was brutal. After signing the resignation, he had hoped to quietly find work at a smaller regional carrier or perhaps a cargo airline where his record might not be so heavily scrutinized. He was wrong. The term voluntary separation was a thin veneer. The aviation community was small and insular. The story of the pilot who kicked a board member off a flight for a racist reason had become a cautionary tale, a legend whispered in crew lounges and training centers. No one would touch him. His ATP license wasn't officially revoked by the FAA, but it was flagged. Any potential employer would see the record of the internal investigation at Pinnacle Air. He was radioactive. The phrase, "Then you'll never fly again," had been an absolute edict. He lost the house. Linda finalized the divorce, taking what little was left. At 58 years old, with no other marketable skills, Richard Morrison found himself renting a room in a rundown apartment complex on the far side of the airport. His new job was driving a shuttle van for an off-site airport parking company, ferrying travelers and flight crews to and from the terminals. The irony was a special kind of torture. Every day he would drive past the gleaming terminals of O'Hare wearing a cheap polyester uniform and watch the sleek jets, Boeing's Airbuses, and even the small CRJ-700s he used to command climb into the sky. He would see pilots in their crisp uniforms, walking with a confidence he once owned, and a bitter acidic envy would churn in his gut. One crisp autumn afternoon, he was dropping off a group at Terminal 3. As he helped a young pilot with his bags, he looked up and saw her, Dr. Isabella Hayes. She was walking toward the security checkpoint, flanked by Robert Chen and David Sterling. She was dressed in a sharp business suit, laughing at something Chen had said. She looked powerful, serene, and completely in her element. She didn't see him. To her, he was just another face in the crowd, another part of the airport's machinery. But he saw her, and in that moment he felt the full, crushing weight of his failure. He had been a captain, a king in his own small sky. Now he was a ghost on the ground, invisible to the very woman whose life he had tried to disrupt, and who had in turn dismantled his. He quickly turned away his face, burning with a shame so profound it felt like a physical illness. The karma for the other players had been just as precise. Mark Jensen's company, a major consulting firm, got wind of the incident when another passenger from the flight, an associate at a rival firm, gleefully shared the story. Jensen was called into a meeting with HR and the head of his department. His entitled behavior was deemed a violation of the company's code of conduct and a potential embarrassment to their corporate image. He wasn't fired, but his expense account was audited, his travel privileges were curtailed, and he was passed over for a major promotion. The seat he had so arrogantly claimed had cost him his career trajectory. On the other side of the ledger, Sarah Jenkins thrived. True to Isabella's word, she received a formal commendation from the CEO's office. She was enrolled in Pinnacle Air's Management Leadership Program. Her confidence, bolstered by the backing of one of the industry's most powerful figures, blossomed. Within 18 months, she was promoted to a purser, the lead flight attendant on international flights, a position of significant responsibility. She never forgot the quiet strength of the woman in seat 1A, and she carried that lesson in professionalism and integrity with her on every flight. Dr. Isabella Hayes continued her work, a quiet force shaping the industry she loved. The Hayes mandates led to a demonstrable drop in passenger complaints and a marked improvement in employee morale at Pinnacle Air. Other airlines began taking notice, adopting similar measures. Her stand on Flight 417 had become a catalyst for real systemic change. Sometimes when she was on a flight looking out the window at the endless blue expanse, she would think of Captain Morrison. She felt no glee at his downfall, only a deep and profound sadness. A sadness for a man so poisoned by prejudice that he had destroyed himself. A sadness for a world where such a stand was still necessary. Her victory wasn't in his ruin, but in the hope that future flights would be safer, fairer, and more respectful for everyone on board, regardless of who they were or what seat they were in. Her quiet promise had been kept not just for him, but for countless others he would now never have the chance to harm. The sky was a little bit clearer. In the end, this wasn't just a story about revenge. It was a story about consequences. Richard Morrison wasn't brought down by a curse or a supernatural force. He was brought down by the direct and predictable outcome of his own actions. He built a prison of prejudice and entitlement, and Dr. Isabella Hayes simply held up a mirror and forced him to see the bars. Her power wasn't just in her title or her shares. It was in her refusal to be diminished, her quiet insistence on her own humanity. This story is a powerful reminder that the choices we make, especially how we treat others, have echoes we can't always foresee. True strength isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about standing firm in your convictions, even when you're speaking in a whisper. What did you think of Captain Morrison's hard karma? Have you ever witnessed something like this? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and be sure to subscribe for more incredible true-life stories of drama and justice. Thank you for listening.